War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In the aftermath of Osama bin Laden's death, the Obama administration has shown no signs of rolling back its military actions abroad. The occupation of Afghanistan continues in full force, while the U.S. has launched new drone attacks in both Pakistan and Yemen, killing at least 10 people. The raid on bin Laden has been criticized for violating Pakistani sovereignty. On Monday, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney said the U.S. will make no apologies for the raid.
We obviously take the statements and concerns of the Pakistani government seriously, but we also do not apologize for the action that we took, that this president took. He said, dating back to the campaign, if there is an opportunity to bring Osama bin Laden to justice and he is on Pakistani soil and this is the only way we can do it unilaterally, he will take that chance and do it, and he did. It's simply beyond a doubt in his mind that he had the right and the imperative to do this.
Well, as the Obama administration continues to engage in military operations abroad, we turn now to the making and sustaining of war from a historical perspective. How do politicians galvanize populations to support wars? Why do people continue fighting in unpopular conflicts even after nationalist fervor has waned? In his new book, author Adam Hochschild examines these questions and many others through the prism of one of the world's bloodiest conflicts, World War I. The book is called To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 1918. Adam Hochschild teaches at the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, co-founder of Mother Jones Magazine, recipient of numerous awards, including the Mark Linton History Prize and Lannan Literary Award. He's also two-time finalist for the National Book Award. Adam Hochschild joins me now in studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Good to be with you.
You look at movements in this book, as you always do, whether you were talking about Congo, whether you were talking about the anti-slavery movement. It's the push for war in this book and the resistance to it. Lay out the story of how World War I began, who was for it, who was against it.
Well, the interesting thing about this war, which really remade the world for the worse in every conceivable way, it killed some 20 million people, military and civilian. The way it ended guaranteed the rise of the Nazis, and the second, even more destructive war, was that in all of the countries involved, there were people who felt the war was madness and shouldn't be fought. They didn't prevail, unfortunately, but I nonetheless wanted to write their story because it seemed to me that when we usually write about wars, we describe them as a contest between one side and the other, whereas I was more interested in this conflict between people who saw the war as a noble and necessary crusade and people who saw it as madness. I focused on England because that's where this anti-war movement was strongest. More than 20,000 British men of military age refused to go into the army when they were drafted. Many of them, as a matter of principle, refused the alternative service offered to conscientious objectors, like driving ambulances at the front or, working in war industries. More than 6,000 went to prison under very harsh conditions, the largest number of people who'd been imprisoned up to that point in time for political reasons in a Western democracy. And they were a remarkable group of people, and happily for me as a writer, they wrote letters, they kept diaries, they published clandestine prison newspapers, and they had interesting relationships with friends and family members who felt differently about the war and in some cases were at the front fighting.
Tell us about Britain's leading investigative journalist who ends up in jail publishing a newspaper on toilet paper, the future Nobel Prize winner for literature. Talk about these people, the suffragists whose families were fiercely divided by World War I.
Some wonderful people. Bertrand Russell, Britain's leading philosopher, and many years later won the Nobel Prize for Literature, was, leading scholar, Cambridge intellectual. When the war broke out, he felt he had to oppose it. And one of the things that makes me respect him so much is that he was so honest about talking about the conflict in his own feelings. Describing himself at that period, he said, "I desired the defeat of Germany as much as any retired colonel, and love of England is very nearly the strongest emotion I possess." But then he went on to say that he felt this war was not being fought for any noble purpose, that it was ludicrous for Britain and France to say that they were fighting for democracy when they were allied with Tsarist Russia, which was an absolute monarchy, And he took a strong stance against the war. He was beyond draft age himself, but he was a strong supporter of the principal organization supporting draft refusers. And as one after another of its leaders were sent to prison for refusing the draft, Russell took over as their honorary chairman, went to the office each day, did the bureaucratic work that people in organizations like that have to do, sending letters around the country to branches about political actions. And then finally in 1918, the government sent him to jail for 6 months. So he was one of these resistors. Another was a young man named Fenner Brockway, who before the war had been the editor of a labor and socialist newspaper, refused the draft, was sent to prison, and continued to publish a newspaper in prison, but it was clandestine because this was completely against the rules, and had to be written on toilet paper and distributed to his fellow prisoners, published for a year before the authorities discovered it and threw him in solitary confinement. But actually through an army deserter who ended up in the same prison, he published the first really uncensored account of the Battle of Passchendaele, a complete slaughter on the Western Front, whereas the British papers that could appear publicly were just publicizing sanitized versions of the battle. So there was a remarkable array of characters.
Talk about the Pankhurst family.
Well, the Pankhursts fascinated me because the way that I decided to tell this story was by looking at divided families. The Pankhursts, Emmeline Pankhurst, the mother, and two of her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, had been the leaders of the most militant faction of the fight for women's suffrage, for getting the vote for women, just before the war in Britain. On the eve of the war, Emmeline Pankhurst, the mother, had been sent to prison for literally throwing a rock through the window of 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence. And then she fled, and she was actually a fugitive from British justice in France at the moment when the war broke out. As soon as the war broke out, she ceased all political activity, put herself at the service of the British government, which sent her on missions, speaking tours around Britain, speaking tours to the United States. They sent her to Russia at one point to try to rally Russian women for the war effort. Meanwhile, her daughter Sylvia was an ardent anti-war activist, published the leading, most widely read anti-war paper in Britain throughout the war. Some of its issues were suppressed by the government. And Sylvia was also having a secret love affair with Keir Hardie, who was the leader of the Independent Labour Party, predecessor of today's Labour Party, another very strong voice against the war until he died, I think, really of grief at the war as much as anything else in 1915. So this was one of several families that was sharply divided by the war, in much the same way as something like the Vietnam War caused divisions in many American families.
Adam Hochschild, you, in your book, talk about the number of people who have died, and if there were a cemetery in this country to show the number of people who have died in war, like they have in Europe.
Yeah, this was a thought that occurred to me walking through the First World War cemeteries. Anybody who's interested in the First World War eventually goes to the old Western Front in France and Belgium, which is an area of the world that I think has the greatest concentration of young men's graves anywhere in the world. Go to anywhere where the greatest fighting took place, the region where the Battle of the Somme was, or the fighting around Ypres or Verdun. You stand on a hilltop and you see 5, 6, 7 cemeteries, enormous ones with, 5,000, 10,000 graves spreading on all sides of you. And it's an overwhelming experience. Yet when I think about the wars we're engaged in today, in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is nowhere that an American or anybody can go and sort of visually see the toll of the war in this sense, especially since the great bulk of the casualties are, Afghani and Iraqi civilians, as well as the American and Allied troops who've died. If they could all be buried in one place, maybe these senseless wars of today would come to a stop sooner.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Adam Hochschild is the author of a number of books. His latest, To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion, 1914 to 1918. When we come back, I want to talk about the marginalization of voices of dissent. This is Democracy